Hi, I'm Ellen Halliday, Deputy Editor of Prospect. You're about to watch the interview portion of the latest episode of the Prospect podcast with this week's special guest. For the full episode with additional discussion from Prospect Senior Editor Alona Ferber and myself, click the link in the description below to listen via your favourite podcast app. And if you'd like to read more of Prospect's award-winning journalism, visit prospectmagazine.co.uk. Gabriel, it's lovely to have you on the Prospect podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I wanted to start off, perhaps because it's Halloween week, also going back to a story that you tell at the beginning of your journey into the coming storm. The book and the podcast sort of begins with this tale about witches and a drawing class. And from that, you learn something or you realize something about the age in which we live now. So what have witches in the Dark Ages got to do with American democracy?
Funny, actually, I'd forgotten this whole journey that I've been on did actually start on Halloween 4 years ago in 2020 at the height of lockdown. And I took an online drawing class. It was kind of a totally random thing because I don't usually do this kind of thing and I'm not that into drawing. It was one of those weird lockdown things. And it was a Halloween themed class and it was called Witches, Drawing and Storytelling. And it was held by this kind of feminist drawing collective called the London Drawing Group. And while they kind of set us doing little drawing exercises, copying out bits of old German woodcuts, one of the people leading this class starts telling a story about this slightly deranged German priest from the 15th century called Heinrich Kramer, who gets obsessed with witches at a time at the sort of end of the feudal period where witches are sort of part of tapestry of medieval life. But, they're not the kinds of evil hags flying around on broomsticks. They're just a kind of accepted part of medieval life. They, lay charms, lift spells, and, nice people to have around. But he's obsessed with witches and that they're kind of these satanic, evil people who've made a pact with the devil. And he writes this book called the Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches. And by and large, the clerical establishment just thinks he's nuts and they just want him gone. He tries to mount all these witch trials and he's slightly deranged and they keep telling him to get out of there. But this book he writes, which would have disappeared into nothing were it not for a piece of tech that had been invented a few decades earlier, notably the printing press. Johannes Gutenberg, a couple of decades earlier, had invented this printing press, and this completely changed the dynamic of who could write things, print things, publish things, and what stories could be disseminated. So he publishes this book, and it kind of goes viral through Europe, and it leads to this 200-year spasm of witch fever, witch madness, a murderous frenzy that starts in Europe, spreads across the Atlantic to the New World. And I'd taken this class just before the 2020 election. I was working for Newsnight at the time. I was reporting for them. I was supposed to be out there reporting on the election, but my visa had run out during lockdown and the embassy was closed. I didn't know whether I was going to get out there. I finally did make it. And when I made it out there just after the election, I met all these people who seemed to be in the grip of another strange sort of madness, a conspiracy theory about a cabal of satanic pedophiles, possibly led by Hillary Clinton, who were trying to steal the election, who was secretly controlling America. And it just chimed with me. I just thought, hold on a second, this sounds very is history repeating itself? And since then, this kind of madness, it's only got weirder, it's only deepened.
So January the 6th, the event itself took you on a journey in your book, The Coming Storm, back into the 90s, the conspiracies of the Clinton era, and also to QAnon, which you just outlined there, this crazy, mad conspiracy theory about who really controls America. And since then, you've gone forwards, you've looked into the trajectory of figures in tech and politics like Peter Thiel and J.D. Vance, who were kind of in that weird, kind of strange space. What has it actually been like for you in the past 3 years, 4 years, being in this world? Have you been kind of convinced somehow by any? I mean, it must be a very strange experience to be in that world.
It's been quite intense to be sort of on and off down various rabbit holes for the past 4 years. I mean, investigating conspiracy theories is an odd thing for a journalist to do because, on the one hand, you kind of set out thinking, okay, this is crazy, and I don't want to spend too much time debunking it because that's just a waste of, this is the kind of stuff we've all been dealing with since the advent of social media. Like, do we waste our time debunking stuff, investigating it, or do we kind of just ignore the weird stories and move on? And that's kind of what I did when I was. This is before January the 6th, but I was out in America and I meet this guy draped in furs, bare chested, horns on his head, who's the guy who first tells me about this conspiracy theory. I was like, okay, I'm going to ignore this because this is just
mad.
It's mad. It's objectively mad, right? And it's not the kind of topic for serious discussion on a serious news program like Newsnight. 2 months later, there he is in the center of the Capitol, and I realized something at that moment, which was that however mad a conspiracy theory is, however bogus, it sometimes can tell us something real about society. And I realized that by not interviewing Jacob Chansley, aka the QAnon shaman, I'd missed a trick, right? I had missed the opportunity to listen to what this person was saying, no matter how kind of mad his story was, and to try to figure out, A, where does it come from? And B, what is it trying to tell me? And I think if you take QAnon as a metaphor, and QAnon's kind of died now and it's moved on, but I think it's encapsulated by a poll from last December, a YouGov poll, where they put the following statement to a sample of Americans: no matter who is officially in charge of the government or other organizations, a single group of people secretly controls the world and it rules the world and controls events together, right? 41% of Americans across the spectrum agreed with that statement, right? So
Crazy.
well, it's crazy. Although, if you take it as a metaphor, this is kind of where I've ended up at the end of my many rabbit holes. If you kind of take it not literally, but as a metaphor for the idea that the people that you vote for, the people that you elected, are perhaps not the most powerful people who are sort of in control of your life, and people feel that they're not in control of their lives because new technology, because climate change, because all sorts of things are kind of disrupting what we think of as our expectations. If you take it as a metaphor and say, well, actually, maybe there are other more powerful forces than our democratic leaders at work, and therefore, what are the forces? Who are the forces that are really kind of controlling the world? Then you kind of think, well,
There's a
yeah,
kernel of truth.
right, a big kernel of truth, right? So that's kind of where I've ended up. But the book and the podcast kind of take me down various rabbit holes, and in a way, what I play with in the book a bit and in the podcast is this tension between investigating things and drawing parallels between people and events across time, sometimes over decades. At what point is that kind of sensible analysis and investigation, and at what point does that kind of tip over into sticky post-its on the walls with bits of string?
Yeah.
the wall of crazy.
What's up behind you on the wall? That's not post-its and stuff, right?
That's not a wall of crazy. That's
Okay.
it's a sign painter's backcloth from northern Iraq.
Fine, that's fine.
A lot of those rabbit holes that you go down in search of answers are online rabbit holes. And a big kind of message of the book is about how destabilizing the internet has been, and the dissemination of information and theories on the internet has been for state power. Can you say a bit more about the ways in which you think internet technology has destabilized state power and why it's been able to kind of rock the system so much?
Well, there's the first kind of obvious way that we've all talked about a lot since 2016 and the election of Trump is social media, which has basically wrested control of the national narrative from people like us, the cabal, right? People in the BBC or Prospect Magazine, or the sort of the establishment of dissemination of ideas, and it's kind of democratized it, or at least that was the idea. It's cracked it all open. Anyone with a bit like Heinrich Kramer with his printing press, like anyone with a cranky idea and a YouTube login can put their idea out there. And sometimes these ideas, no matter how crazy, get traction, right? So that's one obvious thing. And this kind of became fake news in 2016 when Trump was elected, which originally meant new things that purported to be news, but were actually fake. And then it came to mean things that Donald Trump didn't like that people were saying about him, but, its original incarnation. And this has really kind of disrupted, I think, the post-war consensus in many Western democracies about what kinds of ideas it was okay to talk about in public discourse. That Overton window, if you like, to kind of use that phrase that also appeared around that time, 2016, is much wider now, and it's disrupting. It is disrupting the establishment, for good or for ill, and in some cases both. But there are other ways in which technology has been disrupting state power in very deliberate ways. So, for example, cryptocurrencies. I didn't really know anything about cryptocurrencies until I started pulling on these threads of conspiracy theories. And it turns out, and perhaps I should have known this, and some of your listeners will know this, and maybe you guys knew it, but it turns out that cryptocurrencies were the kind of brainchild of various anarcho-capitalists and hyper-libertarians in the 1990s, some of whom were on this niche early email list called the extropian email list, a bunch of transhumanists and kind of people who dreamt about freezing their bodies and sending them off to colonize space, who believed that state control through control of the money supply was a bad thing, and you needed to counter that by creating cryptocurrencies, money that governments couldn't control. And the rise of crypto's obviously had a very uneven few years, but it is still with us, and it's a serious thing, and many people in Silicon Valley take it very seriously. That is a very open and deliberate attempt to claw back state power and put it in the hands of, they would say, the individual. But in fact, when you speak to a lot of these people, what it ends up being, or at least some of them think it is these people, a lot of them are quite into the idea of that they're not really into democracy. They think democracy is kind of sclerotic and bound by bureaucracy, and they're into accelerating. So they believe that eventually cryptocurrencies and other computer technology will sap power from the nation states. Nation states will collapse, the dollar will collapse, crypto will rise. And in this place of nation states, depending on who you talk to, it might be a sovereign individual, to quote a book written by William Rees-Mogg, Jacob's dad, in the late 90s, which was actually quite a prescient book about where technology was going to take us. If you remember, Private Eye used to call him Mystic Mogg rather unkindly, but I don't know who's laughing now, but this book looks pretty prescient. Sometimes they call it network states. There's this whole new movement called the network state movement, led by a bunch of Silicon Valley people who, want to replace countries with corporations, basically. And so the question is this, is computer technology, is the power of the internet, is it really democratizing things, or is it actually just a reallocation of power into different hands?
So who are the people who want to tear democracy down and rebuild something else? Are they Silicon Valley tech bros, or are they different people? What kind of people are buying into this stuff?
Well, definitely Silicon Valley tech bros. I mean, there's a kind of weird alliance, really, between sort of hyper conservatives and Silicon Valley tech bros, who, on the face of it, actually should not make good bedfellows, right? They're just not. They have very
They're
little
not
in common.
conservatives. Yeah.
I mean, just to sort of slightly not answer your question for a second, and I'll come back to it. But one of the ways, there are lots of ways we can look at this election that's coming up. But one of the ways I look at it is not as a fight between the right and the left in America, or even between the right and the center, because we sort of see the Democrats much more as a kind of centrist party. But in America, they're portrayed as the left. I actually see it as a fight between conservatives who want to conserve the system, and that now turns out, weirdly enough, to be the Democrats, and a sort of a tear it all down group of people, this kind of MAGA movement that has taken control of the Republican Party, who believe that the system itself is so rotten, so irredeemably corrupt, that it really needs not completely tearing down, although some people would say so, but very much stripping back and rebuilding and kind of going back to first principles. So that, in a way, is that second bit is the area that I've been examining, those people, and they are a funny alliance. But Silicon Valley libertarians definitely play a big role, and you mentioned Peter Thiel. He's a very powerful Silicon Valley investor, a billionaire. He set up PayPal with Elon Musk in the late 90s, was very influenced by William Rees-Mogg's book, The Sovereign Individual, says so a lot, has said in the past that he doesn't believe that freedom and democracy are compatible. He also has said that one of the great things about tech is that, and this is to quote him, at its best, it is not subject to democratic control, i.e., with tech, you can go about changing the world without having to ask other people's permission. And he thinks this is a good thing, right? You and I may disagree and think it's a bad thing, but he thinks that is absolutely a good thing. So people like Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, quite clearly, is of this sort of accelerationist, tech optimist group of people who I don't think are socially conservative at all, but seem to see in Donald Trump, I think, the disruptor that is most likely to give free rein to their sort of techno-optimist dream.
Is there a plan or a strategy here? Or is it just kind of anarchic chaos and Trump is, a way to smash some things up?
So I think this is where you start kind of treading that line between conspiracy theory and just sort of analysis and reporting and investigating. Is there a plan? I mean, there's a point in my book where I kind of look at the people who were seeding conspiracy theories about the Clintons in the 90s and find, lo and behold, that they're kind of connected to people who are in the 2020s also kind of pushing this techno chaos, conspiracy theory narratives that may advance there. And I sort of flirt with this idea that there's a plan, that there was a plan in the early 90s to seed chaos, and then in the 2020s it would lead to the storming of the Capitol and perhaps accelerate through the sclerotic democratic quagmire into the techno-optimist future of their dreams. Now, I think objectively that is far-fetched, but I think what there is as you said, opportunism. People who, over a number of decades, have had similar ideologies, which include a drastic reduction of state power, a suspicion of democratic state bureaucracy, which is the sort of or we've all had enough of experts kind of fits into that box. This idea that unelected civil servants make decisions in a democracy on behalf of citizens who didn't vote for them. And this strain in American politics, and indeed in British politics, but it's kind of brighter in America, has existed for a while. And what you see across, at least this is what I've kind of find in my book and the podcast, is that across years and decades, you see people opportunistically taking advantage of moments where they can, press their advantage. And I think a lot of these people see Donald Trump as a golden opportunity.
Yeah, I think the place of Trump in this kind of landscape that you've been talking about is really interesting because, I mean, lots of people would describe him as an opportunist. And, people think about him being driven by things including just his personal interest, and you talked about revenge, and that kind of thing, rather than being driven by some great ideological vision of what the world should be like. So where does he fit in? Is he an agent who's driving this view forwards, or is he just there?
I see him less as an agent and more as an avatar. He is an avatar for many people for many different things, right? You see, Elon Musk, the tech bros absolutely love him for their reasons, but you'll see evangelical Christians. I don't know if you saw that photo that was doing the rounds yesterday of them all kind of kneeling, Trump sitting on a chair, and all these evangelical Christians kneeling with their eyes closed and touching him as a sort of Jesus figure, this savior, this unconventional person. People who hate politicians love him because he is the anti-politician, right? So Trump is an avatar, but he himself, his interests are, I think, just himself, and it kind of depends what they are. So he'll rant off about, how he hates windmills because it'll have something to do with his golf courses in Scotland, and and we saw this during when QAnon was coming to prominence in 2020. There's this brilliant clip where this is before the election, before the 2020 election, before January the 6th, and QAnon is really sort of coming to the fore. And finally, a reporter asks him about it at the White House. And this reporter says, Mr. President, there's this thing called QAnon. I don't know if you've heard about it, but the idea is that you are battling this cabal of satanic pedophiles and helping save the world behind the scenes. Is there any truth to this? And you can see him thinking, like, you can see his eyes moving, and he's thinking, and then he goes, well, I don't know a lot about that, but is that supposed to be a good thing or a bad thing? You could see him
What a
thinking,
perfect answer.
brilliant, right? He's just thinking, this could be useful to me. So I think Donald Trump himself has no ideology other than his own success as he sees it.
Yeah. And the kind of thinking that, does lie behind Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, a lot of this comes out of America. Is America more prone to conspiracy than us over here in Europe, or why is this an American phenomenon?
So I think that I don't think Americans are more prone to conspiracy theories than us over here. I think what Americans are is more open, and just more easy to share what may to other people seem like weird and radical opinions. I think in Britain, in England, we calibrate our conversation to whatever we think the beliefs or the worldview of our interlocutor might be. We're kind of very sensitive to that, and we don't want to if we don't know someone well, we don't want to go too far out the box. Except when we're anonymous online, and we see that a lot, right? But in social interactions, Americans are quite different, I think, and this is why America is such a wonderful place to work for a journalist, because you go out there. And people will be very open in sharing kind of quite far out their ideas with you, and especially I find if you take them seriously and you don't laugh at them off the bat, which I think is a bad thing to do, they will share a lot with you, and you can get an insight into what is going on. So I think it isn't a sort of exclusively or even mainly American phenomenon. I think it's happening over here as well, and you can see it happening, especially in the online space. But amongst social interactions as well. As a former BBC reporter, the number of people, the increasing frequency with which I hear people say, "Oh well, there must be some kind of cabal at the BBC who kind of speaks to the government every day and tells you what you're supposed to spew out on your radio and TV channels." That is happening more and more often. So, and also, by the way, it's not confined to the right. We often think of it as more of a right-wing phenomenon, but actually, if you think of this election as a sort of center versus the fringes kind of thing, a lot of the people who are supporting Trump, or Bobby Kennedy Jr., who's now joined Trump's team, are people who come at it from the left, people who, since 2016, since Bernie Sanders didn't get the nomination in 2016 and Hillary Clinton, the kind of ultimate centrist, got it instead, have felt politically homeless and have kind of ended up on the fringes, and they are now part of this alliance. And just to add to that, it's not just a fringe thing as well, because do you remember how the political and media center in 2017 got completely convinced that Donald Trump was a Kremlin agent, and that there was existence of a FSBP tape, which I myself spent some time looking for. I can exclusively reveal that I don't think it exists. I think that was a conspiracy theory.
You mentioned earlier this very shocking statistic, 41% of Americans believing that the politicians they elect aren't actually kind of running the country. And there was new polling earlier this week by the Times that, something like 25% of Americans, Republican and Democrat voters, are think there could be a civil war or violence after this election. What does all of this mean for November's election? What are you expecting in terms of kind of the instability that all of this brings after the 5th of November?
Well, let us assume that it's going to be really tight. Yeah, I mean, I think we should assume that. We should not place too much trust in polls, but I think we could probably assume that it's going to be tight. Let us assume that Donald Trump. Let's imagine that Donald Trump loses. Do we think that he will concede? He didn't last time. If he doesn't, what will the tens of millions of people think, his supporters, who thought that it was stolen last time? And these are tens of millions of people. Now, the fact that there's no solid evidence to back up the idea that the result of the 2020 election came as a result of election fraud is kind of irrelevant at this point. What is relevant is that tens of millions of Americans believe it. So if under that scenario, you can imagine a lot of people who don't feel like they can affect change at the ballot box, and then I don't want to be in the business of predicting violence, but you can draw your own conclusions. You can also sort of do a little calculation about what demographic is the gun owning demographic in that country. On the other side, we should say, like, if Kamala Harris loses and Donald Trump wins, one kind of assumes that, as Hillary Clinton did in 2016, there will be a swift concession. But, did they move on? Was it a graceful concession? No, it wasn't. It was like, oh no, Trump is illegitimate and he's maybe a Kremlin agent. And let us also not forget that the incidents of political violence that have happened during this campaign, there has been one assassination attempt on a candidate, and it was on Donald Trump, right? So political violence is also not the exclusive province of the right. A lot of people, with all these kind of comparisons to Hitler, feel that this is an absolutely existential moment for America. So I do think, given that it's probably going to be really close, I think it's a really dangerous moment. And in a way, what happens on November the 5th is kind of less important than what happens after it.
The kind of story that you've told and some of the numbers that we've talked about give us a sense that America has, or at least tens of millions of Americans have lost a sense of what is real. You've been kind of digging into this world for a number of years now, and I don't expect you to have all of the answers, but what have you learned about how society might learn to rebuild kind of a shared understanding of reality? Because that seems to be the question of what happens after the election. That feels like the path America would need to go down. So how does it do it?
Yeah. I mean, there's one of the people that I write about quite a bit in the book, Akbar Sobek, who's sort of a sort of professional online kind of troll. Started out as an online troll, is now a kind of big Trump booster. But he had this really good way of describing what's been happening in American politics. He said it's like the American people are watching two different movies, all with the same characters but with completely different plot lines. right? And that's kind of where we are, even more so than when he wrote it in 2017. I think a shared factual frame of reference is key. You can't have a democracy if two sets of people don't agree on what's real and what isn't, right? So I think that is really the key to it. And I do think that it's not just the people on the right who believe in the cabal of satanic pedophiles that are the ones who are contributing to this fracturing of of our kind of reality framework, right? One of the incidents that I write about in the book and that we unpicked in the podcast was Hunter Biden's laptop, right? Hunter Biden's laptop appeared as a sort of October surprise a couple of weeks out from the 2020 election. The New York Post wrote it up, and it was basically squished, right? So Twitter locked New York Post out of their account. Facebook downgraded it, reduced distribution of it, saying it was fake news. The FBI had warned the social media companies to be on the lookout for Russian disinformation. 51 former national security chiefs, heads of the CIA and the NSA came out and said this has all the hallmarks of Russian disinformation, blah, blah, blah. A year or so later, it turns out the whole thing was legit. It was real. And not only was it real, but the FBI knew it was real because they had the laptop, or rather the hard drive, in their offices. Now, so on the right, many people saw this as a conspiracy, the cabal, right, working together to suppress a possibly consequential story weeks out from an election. I'm much more inclined to see it as a cock up versus conspiracy. The people who had Hunter Biden's laptop in their drawer didn't tell the people down the corridor whose job it was to go and talk to Facebook and Twitter about the Russian disinformation. That's kind of much more likely. Nevertheless, there are still lots of people who believe that, oh, well, maybe the laptop was real, but kind of the narrative about it being Russian disinformation is true, and actually we should still ignore all of this. That is a very strong kind of drive, I think, also in the center and on the left, in the face of what sometimes appears to be an avalanche of disinformation. And I think what we should all do is take each other's stories a bit more seriously. I mean, that's hard, isn't it? Because sometimes you're kind of faced with a story that is just so outrageously bogus. You think, I'm not going to waste my time with this. It's just nonsense. But I kind of feel like at the end of this journey, even if it looks like nonsense, give people the time of day and listen to what they're saying and try and figure out at the very least why they're saying it. Because most of these people are not bad people. They're not people who are trying to bring everything down. They're people who are genuinely concerned about the world and maybe concerned about it in a misguided way. But, still, that's something that we share.
That's a very human to human kind of message to take away from it.
That's as half full as my
Yeah.
glass gets.
It was quite optimistic.
It's tricky. And I think the idea that almost, so people have real valid concerns and worries, anxieties about the world in which we live, and genuinely feel a lack of control over their own life. I do totally believe that. But it's difficult, isn't it, when that manifests in a desire for a kind of politics or a kind of society that, well, I mean, even the words in which people speak when they advocate for a change, we're talking about anti-Semitic language, racist language. We're talking about the restriction of rights of women and minorities of all kinds. So it's really difficult. And I mean, do you think that the greatest capacity to move forwards, therefore, is at the individual level, or is there something that the institutions themselves that now are undermined, the trust in them is undermined, is something that they can also do to restore that, or is it a lost cause?
I think in the case of America, there is one big thing that they could do, which is repeal Citizens United, this law that allows absolutely eye-watering amounts of money, trillions of dollars, billions and billions of dollars to be spent on election campaigns, which by definition means that elections are being bought. by billionaires and big corporations, right? There's no two ways about that. You can't really argue with that. And so I think that would be one big thing, systemic thing that you could do to make Americans feel like their vote and their contributions matter more. I mean, I think it's obviously not going to solve everything, but it's something you could do.
Yeah. And Gabriel, where are you going to be for the election
I think I'm
next
going to be.
week?
I'm going to be in Florida. I'm doing the overnight election program for Channel 4. I think I'm going to be in Florida. I'm trying to talk my way into Mar-a-Lago, but I'm not sure how well
Wow,
that's
good luck
going.
to you. I hope you get it. You managed to go in there.
Yeah, so do I.
Yeah. Florida should be interesting. Well, we'll look forward to hearing your dispatches from there and hope that America doesn't fall apart
Fingers crossed.
afterwards. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Wow. I feel terrified now.
Yeah.
God, yes, I have tend to have that effect on people. Sorry about that.